When we say that the narcissist's mind is built to defend rather than to relate, we are not describing a character flaw so much as a psychological structure. This is not about someone being selfish or difficult. It is about how their inner world has learned to survive. At some point, usually early in life, connection became unsafe, unpredictable, or conditional. To protect against that pain, the psyche constructed a system that prioritizes control, image, and self-protection above emotional truth. What looks like confidence is often a shield. What looks like certainty is often fear that cannot be felt directly. In healthy relationships, differences are processed through curiosity and repair. There is a shared reality that both people can question and adjust. With a narcissist, that shared reality does not truly exist. Their nervous system experiences disagreement as threat, not information. When you offer feedback, set a boundary, or express hurt, their body does not hear it as a request for understanding. It hears danger, and danger activates defense. These defenses are not always loud. They can be subtle, even sophisticated. Gaslighting, minimization, reframing, selective memory, moral positioning, all of these are ways of preserving a fragile sense of self. They do not arise because the narcissist wants to harm you, but because their internal world cannot tolerate vulnerability. To admit fault, to feel shame, to acknowledge dependence, these experiences threaten the structure that keeps them psychologically intact. This is why conversations feel circular. You explain, they deflect. You clarify, they reinterpret. You try again, and the ground shifts beneath you. The goal is not mutual understanding. The goal is self-preservation. When reality becomes uncomfortable, it is reshaped. When emotions arise that cannot be integrated, they are projected. When accountability looms, it is reframed as attack. From a psychological perspective, this is not conscious manipulation in every moment. It is an automatic system. The mind has learned that staying intact requires staying defended, and so it does what it must to avoid collapse. But for the person on the other side, this creates a constant sense of disorientation. You begin to doubt your memory, your tone, your intentions. You feel as though you are always one step away from being misunderstood, no matter how carefully you speak. Philosophically, this reveals a painful truth. Relationship requires the willingness to be changed by the other, to be affected, to be seen. The narcissistic structure cannot risk this. It does not meet you in openness, it meets you in armor. And armor may protect, but it cannot connect. This is why winning is impossible from the start. You are not engaging with a person who is oriented towards shared truth. You are engaging with a system oriented towards self-defense. Your clarity becomes their threat. Your needs become their challenge. Your humanity becomes something to manage rather than receive. Understanding this is not about blame. It is about reality. When you see the structure for what it is, you stop taking the distortions personally. You stop expecting repair where repair cannot happen. You begin to recognize that the exhaustion you feel is not from conflict, but from trying to connect with a system that is not designed for connection. Once you understand that the narcissistic mind is organized around defense rather than connection, the next realization becomes unavoidable. The usual tools of resolution simply do not apply. Most of us are raised to believe that if we explain clearly, stay calm, present facts, and appeal to fairness, something will eventually shift. We trust that truth has weight, that logic persuades, and that empathy opens doors. In narcissistic dynamics, these assumptions quietly collapse. The narcissist does not relate to truth as something to be discovered together. Truth is not a shared landscape, it is a resource to be managed. Information is accepted only when it supports the self-image and rejected when it threatens it. This is not stubbornness in the ordinary sense. It is a psychological necessity. To accept certain realities would expose shame, vulnerability, and dependence, experiences their inner world cannot safely hold. So the mind does what it must. It edits, reframes, and distorts. You may notice how facts are selectively remembered, how conversations are reinterpreted, how intentions are questioned. What you experienced as a moment of honesty becomes, in their retelling, an act of cruelty. What you offered as feedback becomes, in their version, an attack. The point is not to arrive at accuracy. The point is to preserve coherence within their self-narrative. Reality becomes flexible when the ego feels threatened. Even moral appeals fall into this distortion. When you speak of fairness, respect, or mutual responsibility, you are inviting a shared ethical space. But for the narcissist, this space is conditional. Ethics apply when they affirm superiority or innocence. When they imply accountability, they are experienced as judgment. The conversation then shifts away from the original issue and toward your supposed flaws, your tone, your timing, your motives. What feels like dialogue to you becomes a stage for dominance. From a psychological standpoint, this is why interactions feel draining and confusing. You are engaging in good faith, expecting reciprocity, while the other person is protecting an internal structure at all costs. The energy you bring to be understood is absorbed and repurposed to maintain control. You leave the conversation not with clarity, but with doubt, questioning your memory, your values, even your sanity. Philosophically, this reveals a sobering truth about human communication. It only works when both parties are oriented toward truth rather than self-protection. When one person's survival strategy depends on distortion, communication becomes a loop with no exit. You cannot reason someone into vulnerability when their entire system is designed to avoid it. This is where many people exhaust themselves. They keep refining their words, softening their tone, gathering evidence, believing that one day the right argument will break through. But the structure they are facing is not waiting to be convinced. It is waiting to be defended. The more you try to win through reason, the deeper you remain inside a game that has already been decided. Understanding this is not cynicism. It is clarity. It allows you to release the fantasy that logic or fairness will restore balance. It frees you from the burden of proving your reality to someone who cannot receive it. And it returns your energy to where it belongs. Your own life, your own healing, your own sense of truth. When you finally accept that the narcissistic dynamic is not built for mutuality or truth, something profound begins to shift. At first, this realization can feel like loss. You grieve the relationship you hoped for, the conversations that never quite happened, the understanding that always seemed just out of reach. But beneath that grief is a quieter, deeper movement, the return of your own authority. You stop organizing your life around another person's distortions, and you begin to trust your own perception again. This is the point where the real work begins, not in changing them, but in reclaiming yourself. For a long time, your nervous system has been shaped by unpredictability. You learn to scan for cues, to adjust your tone, to anticipate reactions. Your body became a negotiation tool. Over time, this creates a subtle form of self-abandonment. You stop asking what you feel and start asking what will keep the peace. You stop listening to your inner signals because they have been repeatedly dismissed or reframed. From a trauma-informed perspective, this is not weakness. It is adaptation. The body and mind learn to survive by staying hyper-attuned to someone else's emotional state. But survival is not the same as living. Healing begins when you no longer need to contort yourself to feel safe. It begins when you choose to honor your own reality, even when it is inconvenient to someone else. This shift is not dramatic at first. It is quiet. It looks like pausing before you explain yourself. It looks like noticing when your chest tightens and choosing to step back instead of engaging. It looks like setting boundaries without over-justifying them. These are not acts of aggression, they are acts of self-respect. You are teaching your nervous system that you no longer need to earn your right to exist as you are. Philosophically, this is a return to dignity. To be human is to be affected, to feel, to need. The narcissistic dynamic denies this by turning relationship into performance and connection into control. When you step out of that structure, you are not rejecting the other person. You are reclaiming the part of yourself that was silenced to maintain the illusion of harmony. There may be moments of doubt. You may wonder if you are being selfish, cold, or unkind. These questions often arise because you have been conditioned to equate self-erasure with love. But true compassion does not require you to disappear. It does not ask you to betray your own inner truth. In fact, the more you honor yourself, the more authentic your relationships can become, whether with others or with yourself. As you integrate this understanding, you begin to notice a new steadiness. You no longer feel compelled to win, to prove, or to explain. You recognize that your worth does not depend on being understood by someone who cannot see you. You carry your truth with you, not as a weapon, but as a grounding presence. And in that presence, you find something that was missing all along: peace. This is not the end of a battle. It is the end of a war you were never meant to fight. As you step into this new steadiness, another truth often reveals itself, one that can be uncomfortable, but also deeply liberating. The narcissistic dynamic does not only shape the one who holds power, it also quietly reshapes the one who adapts. Over time, you may begin to recognize patterns in yourself that you do not fully like: the people-pleasing, the over-functioning, the habit of doubting your own needs, the reflex to explain and justify even the smallest boundary. These are not flaws. They are survival strategies learned in an environment where emotional safety was conditional. From a trauma-informed lens, this is where compassion must expand to include you. Your nervous system was trained to stay alert, to manage another person's moods, to sense danger before it arrived. This kind of hyper-vigilance is not a personality trait, it is a physiological state. It arises when connection is inconsistent, when love is paired with fear, when approval feels like oxygen. You did not choose these patterns. They chose you because they helped you endure. But what once protected you can now limit you. The same strategies that kept you safe in a dysfunctional dynamic can keep you small in a healthier one. You may notice how you minimize your desires, how you second-guess your perceptions, how you feel responsible for other people's emotions. These habits feel normal because they have been rehearsed for years. Yet they quietly reinforce the belief that your needs are a burden and your boundaries are a threat. This is the moment where healing becomes an act of courage. It requires you to gently question the story you have been telling yourself, that love must be earned, that conflict means abandonment, that your worth is measured by how well you accommodate others. These beliefs were not born in you, they were absorbed. And what is learned can be unlearned, not through force, but through awareness and patience. Philosophically, this is an invitation to redefine what power truly means. Power is not dominance, control, or emotional withdrawal. Power is the capacity to remain present with yourself, even when it is uncomfortable. It is the willingness to feel without collapsing, to say no without guilt, to choose truth over approval. When you reclaim this kind of power, you no longer participate in dynamics that require you to shrink. As you practice this, something subtle changes in your relationships. You stop attracting people who thrive on control because you are no longer available for it. You begin to recognize red flags not as challenges to overcome, but as information to honor. You move through the world with a clearer sense of what feels right, and you trust that feeling enough to act on it. This does not make you hardened, it makes you whole. You are no longer organizing your life around someone else's wounds. You are meeting your own with honesty and care. And in doing so, you create the conditions for a connection that is not rooted in fear, but in mutual respect. This is the quiet revolution. When you choose yourself, you end the cycle and begin a life that is finally your own. By the time you reach this stage of awareness, something essential has already changed inside you. You are no longer asking, "How do I make this work?" but "What is this costing me?" That shift in perspective is not small. It is the beginning of emotional sovereignty. You start to see that the greatest damage of a narcissistic dynamic is not what is said or done to you, but what it slowly teaches you to believe about yourself. Many people emerge from these relationships carrying a quiet shame that does not belong to them. They feel defective for not being enough, for not finding the right words, for not fixing what was never theirs to fix. But shame, as a psychological experience, is relational. It grows in environments where authenticity is punished and conditional approval replaces safety. Over time, you may internalize the voice of the one who diminished you, and it becomes an inner critic that questions your worth even in their absence. From a trauma-informed perspective, this is the residue of prolonged emotional stress. The nervous system has learned to brace, to doubt, to anticipate rejection, and so even when the external threat is gone, the internal echo remains. You may find yourself apologizing, overachieving, or settling for less than you deserve simply because it feels familiar. The mind confuses familiarity with safety. Healing at this level requires more than insight. It requires compassion toward the parts of you that adapted to survive. You are not broken. You are patterned. And patterns can change. Each time you notice the old voice rising and choose to respond with kindness instead of criticism, you are rewriting a story that was never truly yours. You are teaching your nervous system that it no longer needs to live in defense. Philosophically, this is a return to dignity. To be human is to be worthy of care without conditions. When you reclaim this truth, you stop negotiating your value. You no longer accept relationships that require you to perform or prove. You choose environments where your presence is not tolerated, but welcomed. As this inner shift deepens, you begin to relate to others from a different place. You listen more to your body. You trust your emotional responses as information, not weakness. You allow yourself to leave situations that diminish you without needing a dramatic justification. This is not avoidance, it is discernment. And in this discernment, you rediscover something quietly powerful: self-trust. Not the loud, performative kind, but the steady knowing that you are allowed to take up space, to feel, to choose differently. This trust becomes your anchor. It guides you away from dynamics that replicate old wounds and toward those that support your growth. This is not about becoming invulnerable. It is about becoming real. And in that reality, you find a freedom that no one else can grant or take away. Because when you stop carrying a shame that was never yours, you finally stand in the truth of who you have always been. At the far edge of this journey, after insight, after grief, after the slow reclamation of self, there is one final shift that brings everything into coherence. You no longer define your life in opposition to what hurt you. The narcissistic dynamic is no longer the reference point around which your identity turns. Instead, you begin to live from an inner orientation that is rooted in choice rather than reaction. This is where freedom truly takes form, not as a dramatic escape, but as a steady, embodied way of being. For a long time, your nervous system has been organized around threat. Even in moments of calm, part of you remained braced, anticipating the next emotional disruption. This state of vigilance is exhausting, and yet it can feel strangely familiar. When it begins to soften, you may notice an unexpected discomfort, not because something is wrong, but because your body is learning a new rhythm. Peace can feel foreign when chaos has been the norm. But with time, the body learns that safety does not require constant alertness. This is where integration happens. The insights you have gained are no longer just ideas, they become lived experience. You respond rather than react. You pause instead of rushing to fix. You choose connection that feels nourishing rather than draining. You recognize that you are not responsible for managing another person's inner world. Your task is to tend to your own with honesty, patience, and care. Philosophically, this is the movement from survival to meaning. When we are trapped in defensive cycles, life narrows. Our energy is consumed by proving, avoiding, or enduring. When we step out of those cycles, life expands. We become curious again. We imagine possibilities not shaped by fear. We begin to ask, not how do I protect myself, but what kind of life do I want to live? This question opens a new chapter. You may find yourself drawn to different people, different work, different ways of being. You honor your limits without apology. You welcome joy without suspicion. You allow yourself to be seen, not for who you were in the past, but for who you are becoming. This is not reinvention, it is remembrance. And perhaps most importantly, you stop seeking closure from those who cannot offer it. You no longer need their acknowledgement to validate your experience. You carry your own truth with quiet confidence. It is not fragile. It does not need to be defended. It simply is. This is the culmination of the journey, not triumph over another, but peace within yourself. Not control, but clarity. Not perfection, but presence. And in this presence, you discover that the life you were waiting for has already begun.